Prendre vos places, s'il vous plaît, on va démarrer la deuxième journée de notre congrès. So welcome everybody to the second edition and the second day, on the 2nd of November, of the Chenin Blanc International Congress. Bienvenue, nos amis. Je vois pas les Français.
I don't see the French here. You've changed places. All the French people were in the front yesterday.
Just a few things before we start the interventions, while people are still coming in. First important thing is please don't take your headset with you when you leave the auditorium. If you don't use it, leave it under your seat. And if you use it, fantastic, but please don't take it. It doesn't work outside of the auditorium. Je vais tout dire en français aussi. Les écouteurs, ne le prenez pas.
The lady's just repeating in French what she said. We lost 9 headsets yesterday.
That's the one thing. The second thing is just a little bit on the program today. This is session, what we call B1 and B2 that will take place. It is all about viticulture and winemaking and research and how to convert that into practice. So a lot of exciting interventions today. Cet après-midi, il y a...
This afternoon, we have another outing, but...
fully booked. But the good news is, if you walk out of the auditorium and you go to the Herehuis, again, what is the Herehuis in English? Oh, the Manor House. The Manor House is, you will find the Chenins of the world tasting. So those that are not taking part this afternoon on the sortie, si vous ne sortez pas sur la sortie cet après-midi, s'il vous plaît, allez-y à côté, dans la maison, c'est-à-dire...
This is just a repetition again. So, we're starting straight away. We're a little bit late. So, we're starting with Mrs. Evelyne de Pontbriand, who not only is the president of the Academy of Chenin Blanc, but she's going to also give us this talk. The title being Landscape in the Loire, Chenin Blanc and the concept of the vignoble jardin, so the garden vineyard. Can you hear me?
We have this light. Do we have to have this light on? But I don't see you. Yes.
Je vais me mettre à côté de vous ici.
Tu crois que ça va marcher?
Oui. Et vous me dites quand je fais... Comment vous voulez faire? Vous me dites...
Oui.
Comme ça.
So, do you hear me? Yeah. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about landscape. I think yesterday was extremely interesting. We went into the real intimacy of Chenin Blanc, learning about its DNA and the chromosomes. This is physical. Now we are going to go into the intimacy of grape and then Chenin Blanc, but into its memory. I think memory is something that is also very important in the wine world. Now I'm going to do the presentation in French, and I think it will be translated. Voilà. Alors,
so, wine is probably, we're starting from the Neolithic. It was a very important product in our civilization.
Wrote it in English also for you. So, landscape and culture, before they are nature, construct of imagination projected onto wood and water and rock and vine and garden. But it should also be acknowledged that once a certain idea of landscape, a myth, a vision, establishes itself in an actual place, it has a peculiar way of modeling categories, of making metaphors more real than their reference, of becoming, in fact, part of the scenery. Alors, je vais le dire en français. Donc, les paysages sont culture avant d'être nature. Ils sont construction d'imagination.
So, it's just been repeated in French, landscape or culture, etc. So I repeat it, it should also be acknowledged that once a certain idea of landscape, a myth, a vision establishes itself in an actual place, it has a peculiar way of muddling categories, of making metaphors more real than their reference, of becoming, in fact, part of the scenery. So the memory of our Western civilization helps us to understand, well, all the wealth. I'm talking about viticulture, vine. So originally, thank you. So originally from the north of the Fertile Crescent, there are also other vitis vinifera that have been discovered since, but the cultivated vine progressed southward to reach the Jordanian Valley around 4000 BC, Egypt and Mesopotamia around 3000 BC, and then Greece around 2500 BC. Wine-growing landscapes are charged with a very old imagination in Western civilization, and they represent, like the gardens and the wheat fields, a civilization that was built on agriculture when human beings first settled. In other words, that's mastering nature. Now, if we speak about the vine as a garden, in the Loire Valley, it's first to understand the entire history of the vine and the garden in our Western civilization, with its link to the search for knowledge, to the divine, and to the aesthetics of the landscape, and also to economic and political issues. We're going to talk about the history of the food garden, with this permanent preoccupation of man to want to appropriate and domesticate the wild, to nourish himself physically as well as intellectually, and also of the place of the vine, then very recently of the Chenin, in this garden. We're talking about man and his relationship with the living animal and the plant world, which has evolved over time along with his view of nature, closely linked to the evolution and organization of society, and to the notion of power, religion, the advancement of scientific knowledge, the economy, and to geography. We'll look at some examples to talk about the vine in the famous gardens of antiquity. Obviously, the Garden of Eden, the Garden of the Hesperides, the gardens of Ammon in Egypt, also the latifundias, can't forget those, the gardens of the abbeys and their vineyards, the closeries, and the royal castles of the Renaissance, the castle of Sanssouci, in Austria, and others, to finish with the concept of the agricultural organization born in the 19th century, which is still visible in Anjou and in particularly in Savinière. Actually, Savinière is where I make my wine. This civilization has been based for thousands of years on two products which of fermentation, which is bread and wine. You know, we don't think about it, but this fermentation was a mystery for a very long time. So while actually this was a mystery for man. And in this food garden, a man was always searching for knowledge. He meets God, in inverted commas. That's the first human response to the mystery of life. Well, there are others, of course. So I'm not going to go into detail now about fermentation, but it allowed man to to adapt to the food before there were the wild animals and what they found. But when they started cultivating, so fermentation allowed a certain number of problems to be solved. First of all, there was beer, which came before wine, and then wine, being more complicated to make and more expensive, took on a more noble connotation. But fermentation remained mysterious until the 1850s, when Pasteur discovered its mechanism. And what had been unexplained for a long time had been attributed to the divine hand. But then Pasteur actually replaced God at that point. Now, there are the Gardens of Eden now. This is one of the famous hanging gardens of Babylon. We don't know if this this really existed. But there was ceramics which were used for wine, and also to offer to God. So that's a relationship with God, and cultural practices. Have you heard of the Epic of Gilgamesh? It's the oldest known literary text from ancient Mesopotamia. It was written in cuneiform on 12 clay tablets discovered in the 19th century during the excavation of the library of King Ashurbanipal of Nineveh. And I think that you can remember, because it reminds you that it would ensure his immortality, the enchanted wine. And wine, which they call the beer of the mountains, is a sacred drink according to many religious rites. Okay, so we find a rather similar story, very well illustrated on this crystal vase, which is much more recently in the story of intoxication of Noah. It was quite amusing because yesterday we went to to a vineyard, and I thought it was like I was visiting Noah's Park, and the same story occurred there. The myth of Noah, you know it. And once he had solved humanity and nature, he started drinking wine, and he got intoxicated. So when you read with the new translations of the Bible, you can see that he was asked by God to save nature. So it's the same story of Gilgamesh in the end of the day. So in Egypt, Wine was considered a sacred drink of the gods and of the heroes, and also the kings, and it accompanied the kings in the graves, and it was part of their funeral practices. Inside a tomb dated to 3,300 to 3,150 BC, it was they found 700 jars, whereas Tutankhamun only had 27. But that was to accompany. There's a beautiful tomb in Egypt. Unfortunately, I couldn't find a good photo, but it's the splendid tomb of Senefer, 1439 to 1413 before BC, and he was responsible for the gardens of the god Amun, one of the main Egypt deities. You can see on the picture, well, no, before that, the garden surrounded by a wall, probably made of mud bricks, topped with small tile arches, and the visitor entered a large courtyard planted with vines, which may have inspired the craftsmen who decorated the ceiling of those underground rooms. Most of the garden, which is laid around the vineyard, has a geometric and symmetrical layout with paths lined with trees and shrubs of varying sizes. So it's like we can call it the first garden à la française. It was a vine produced not for trading, but it was in relation to these practices only. I think I've forgotten something. Can we go back? I think you all know. I think you all know the story of Adam and Eve. We always say that Eve, who was in the Garden of Eden, and God forbade them to touch the tree of knowledge of good and good and evil. So it's always the idea of looking for scientific searching. And Cranach did a beautiful drawing with an apple. Actually, it turns out that it was more fruits, so we don't really know. Maybe it was a grape. Why was this forbidden? Maybe because it was going to lead to intoxication. So that's what we go back in the history of it. Now, in the more European part of the Mediterranean, in the Greek, in the text, viticulture is linked to a science which is spread out. It's more a scientific approach. So vine appears in Athenian mythology as the fruit of an art brought from outside, reviled by a divine traveler called Dionysus. That's Roger Dion says. So we find the image of the Garden of Eden and the Tree of Knowledge in the Garden of the Hesperides with Heracles, who must bring back those golden apples. So, contrary to what we commonly think, Dionysus wasn't only the god of wine, and not always involved in orgies. It's interesting because he's a god who dies and comes to life every year. So, in other words, he's the god of vegetation. We've got that notion of resurrection, which is something quite new, really. He's the god of everything which is circulated and which goes round, and it's to do with everything to do with life. All the vital juices: sap, urine, sperm, milking, blood, and so you see there's always this notion And just like in the Vedic Soma, wine is supposed to help conquer immortality. We all know the story of Jesus, and it's interesting to see the Last Supper and the Passion of Jesus, which also happen around wine and bread, which represent immortality, and in a garden. Then we come to the Roman Empire, which developed agricultural properties, very big ones, which were known as latifundium. And the production, according to the region, was specialized in wine, cereals, or olives. And Jean-Robert Petit says, so strong was the Roman attachment to the trees and garden setting that the bel paesaggio that they tried to impose everywhere in the empire outside of its harmony. There is no happiness. This is what Pitt says about the Romans. So there was this awareness of harmony and countryside and landscapes. It wasn't just producing wine to sell it, which is fine, but when you come away from this garden, out of this garden, you start having the notion of landscape, and then this wine, the search for immortality. You come away from the myth, and then you come into the idea of marketing wine in terms of the landscape where it originates from. And the Roman Empire, was huge, and also they were in Gaul, France today, and they also planted wines. The Gauls were great lovers of wine. Nothing has changed. To satisfy the very important market, the vine was planted more and more towards the north. It did take time because when they planted more to the north, they need to adapt the various varieties, and so you start seeing the beginning of how these vines were started to be planted in France, especially by the monks. And so, as Pliny says, you've got the Bituriges Bordeaux, and they brought in a grape variety which could withstand the gusts coming from the Atlantic. So that's the first sort of adaptation, if you like. And then within a few centuries, vineyards were developed in the Moselle area, around Lutetia, in Limagne area, and then in the vicinity of Tours, Angers, and Nantes. At the same time as this development of the vine, neither the olive nor the citrus trees could be allowed to survive. So the gardens were modified, and the landscapes became almost a replica of the Italian landscapes. The deciduous trees were substituted in the gardens. Then Christianization of Gaul played a very important role in the spread of wine, especially because of the numerous abbeys. You see the abbeys in the Loire Valley, and then the wine tradition was considered in the Middle Ages as a sort of a medicine most of the time. Well, some of the time. And also there was the tradition, the commercial tradition as well, as with the Romans. So the image of the garden in the medieval monasteries is not simply a matter of admiration for nature. It reflects a worldview specific to the medieval universe. I find that very interesting every time, how how it all changes. And then at the center of all this, you find God. It's an imperfect mirror of heaven. So we need to rise to the divine. Nature should be contemplated not for its aesthetic value, but for its symbolic content. Nature is spiritual, its reality is not exclusively material. But, of course, the monks didn't just contemplate nature, they used the wine for the religious services, but it was very important to offer wine to their guests and also to generate income. And that was a very important source of income. The market was very important. They were educated. Don't forget, at the time, very few people knew how to write, but the monks did. So there were these exchanges amongst the abbeys, and they could adapt. There's an interesting something that Roger Dion wrote. An ordinance of King John Lackland in 1199, fixing the price of wine sold in England, lists first those from the Poitou, then from Anjou, and then those from France. So the abbey gardens were mainly vegetable and fruits as well, and medicinal plant gardens or orchards. Vines at that time were probably often planted in enclosed areas, just such as gardens, to protect them against wild animals. So, what about the Chenin in all this? As we saw yesterday, it was probably mentioned already in the 9th century AD, and then Anjou goes back to probably it's mentioned in, as we said, in the book of Rabelais, which is mentioned yesterday, in the Gargantua and Pantagruel, and wine is described as a nice wine with curative properties. But the rector of the university said it was good for health, remember? I noted another phrase. It said the Anjou wines were mostly white and sweet, and that is since 1550. So that's really our first mention of the Chenin as the dominant species in Anjou. I don't know why the text has been blotted out, but so the Chenin is in the gardens, and Cavalier wrote that it was that the wines were mainly white, and those of the top quality were from the hillsides. So the Chenin was planted there because of its geology, because of its geography and the climate. And it was threatened at some stage, and it regressed. But I read something else that she mentions a very well-known vineyard, which was initially planted with red grapes. And now in the 21st century, it's another story. Let me go back a little bit. In the Loire Valley, we've got the chateaus, the royal gardens, and we see the architectural style from Italy. There's a lot of Italian influence in the Chateau of the Loire, also in the gardens. And now you've got Chambord on the right, and you see a new vineyard which was planted in Chambord, very geometrical, as in the Latifundia in Rome, ancient Rome. So that's a very beautiful vineyard, and just so numerous wine estates were developed in the Loire Valley, such as the Château de Valmer, which is one of the most beautiful examples of a garden vineyard. It plays a very important role in its various Italian-style terraces. And so you do find some vineyards there. It's a setting which was built in the 16th to the 18th century, and it's sitting like in a wine-growing landscape of Vouvray. So you've probably tried you will be trying the Valmer wines later. So here you see now, it's no longer a garden, the vineyard. It's very much more intensively cultivated, and it obviously therefore also to the mainstay, the economic mainstay of the estate. Also, in the Val de Loire, you find the bourgeois vineyards, what we call the houses in the fields. I'm not going to read this whole text to you, but the last paragraph is interesting. The whole thing must be done in an aesthetic way. The house must be of good architectural quality in its form, its layout, the quality of its materials, and the fittings. And it's mentioned the windows, staircases, fireplaces. And the gardens and the orchards must be landscaped in the Italian style, which we call à la Française. So we've kept this notion of the beauty of the landscape and the gardens. I've given you an example, which isn't from the Loire Valley. I lived in Germany for a long time, and so there's the Sans Souci Chateau. So Frederick II built it in Potsdam. He didn't like the landscapes which in the English style, He wanted to do a very much more controlled, very much something in the French style, if you like. So he built a terrace, and it's very interesting because at the same time it's like bringing out the beauty of the chateau on top, and also to protect nature. And so you've got these little hothouses, and then you've got the vine alongside these hothouses on a slope. It's really magnificent. This it's not, of course, a vineyard which is going to bring in lots of money. It's a collection. So you see, it's like a catalogue of various vines, a large collection of vines. As I've seen, there is Chenin there. So it's very interesting to see that at the time of Linnaeus, who did the classification, that man also wanted to start giving numbers, giving classifications to all that. We'll come back to the Val de Loire, don't worry. So this is a case which I know very well. So towards the middle of the 19th century, the Parisian middle class, upper middle class, the investors, in fact, they came to Savagnin, and they considerably modified the landscape by developing their wine estates. So they did more in the style of parks. So here you can see quite a romantic conception of nature. And so it was, so the vineyard is an agricultural organism. And today there's only Chenin, but it's also a park, a landscaped agricultural park with pastures for animals, fields for crops, water, collections of trees and bushes. You see, you're back to that notion of collection. And then wild areas such as the Coulées. So these are little valleys perpendicular to the Loire Valley, and they sort of give some sort of a rhythm to the landscape. At the same time, there was a winemaker, Pierre Constant Guillory, who planted a number of grape varieties. You know, he wanted to see what would work best. So a lot of rouge, and he also created some terraces. And on these terraces, as I said, he planted red varieties. But today, we've only got a few Cabernet Franc and mainly Chenin, a bit of Sauvignon as well.
Coming to the end, so today the Savonière vineyard is seen by the wine growers as a landscape vineyard with an organization that it's interesting that it has created a natural balance of biodiversity that is very favorable to Carib terrains. In fact, they came because of phylloxera, which had destroyed a large part of the vineyards, and not everything had been replanted. So in some way, nature had actually taken over again. But now we are very happy because we've now got some kind of biodiversity. And around these coulées, which had become corridors, are very attractive to bats. However, these bats, of course, are predators of eudemies and coquelies, which are vineyard pests. So at the moment, now we're talking about 2022, there's the aspect of balance and natural reserve that is of great importance to all these wine growers who have no house in this vineyard and therefore also no garden, of course. So Chenin is perfectly adapted to this landscape and climate. Of course, and provided we don't have too much drought or frost. So now we only have 5 castles left. The others are still there, but 5 properties that have retained their organization, that have very beautiful parks and gardens that are closely linked to the vineyard. And the aesthetics of the vineyard setting is part of the assets of these properties. And of course, we can come back a little. There you have the view from the famous Coulées de Ceylon with this alley of cypress trees, which is a central part of the vineyard, an exceptional view. I talked about Sauvignières, of course, but there are many other properties as well in Anjou that are still organized in this way, and which is part of the heritage of the past. Thank you very much for your attention.
This one is working. Merci beaucoup, Evelyne. Jamie, to call you up without any grand introduction because you don't need too much of introduction, but we are looking forward to your presentation. I can do it for you if you want. Okay. Technicalities.
Yeah.
Don't show it to the screen.
Huh?
Got to go to the guys. And please talk a little bit slowly for the translation.
Okay, yeah. About 30 minutes.
Well, you take your time.
Hey, good to be here. Just waiting for my presentation. This is a little bit of a change of pace. Just to introduce myself, my background is I was a scientist. I did a PhD in plant biology, and then I worked as a science editor for 15 years. But during that process, I caught the wine bug, And so I started, the internet came along, so I started, you know, like everyone does, you know, back in the late 90s, you know, you started a little website, hobby website. And I found that with all the bulletin boards discussing wine online, it was a really exciting phase because you could chat with, you know, wine geeks and wine professionals on these bulletin boards and learn a great deal very quickly. And so I started earning money outside of my paid employment as a science editor, and it grew and grew to the point where I went full-time doing wine in 2008. So I bring to this conference, I guess, a scientific background, an understanding of plant biology, and applying that to viticulture. But also, I'm a wine geek, and I've spent a lot of years, well, probably about 4 or 5 years now, with a break for the pandemic, just traveling around the wine world. And I think that sort of ground truthing and context has been really helpful. So I try to make science approachable. That's one of my key goals, is to take the science without destroying the essence of what makes it really interesting, without diluting it down, but then translating it to the real world problems faced by wine growers. And that's where traveling the wine world for 300 days a year for the last 5 years has been quite useful. So I've written some books. I started off writing Wine Science, that's now in its 3rd edition. A few other things as well, and the latest one has been a short book on regenerative viticulture, and that's the title of this topic because I think it's the new buzzword in the wine world, and I think it's very exciting because this is bringing science, really good science, to bear. And I think science has got a bad rap in viticulture because the previous iterations of science, the way it's been applied, has been a diminished view of science, where we've looked at the vine as the crop plant, and all our attention has been on the vine, and we've just seen the soil and the vineyard environment as merely an inert growth medium in which the vine grows. And that's a diminished view of science, which I'm hoping to explain in this talk. So the Regenerative Viticulture book, I should add, has also been translated into French, Viticulture Régénératrice, by a guy called Stéphane Revel, and so that's just been launched fairly recently. And I think it's something I've been trying to do is get more of my books translated into other languages. The Authentic Wine's been translated into Spanish fairly recently, so that's been quite good. So the thing about viticulture is currently we see viticulture in 3 different categories, and this is the kind of the way that people think about it. They think about conventional viticulture, sustainable viticulture, organics and biodynamics. And currently it's sort of seen as a hierarchy of virtue. So we start off with conventional at the bottom, and if you're good, you'll start farming sustainably, and then if you're really good, you go to organics and biodynamics. And I think this is simplistic. I think this is not the way we should be thinking. So conventional, we see the soil as merely a medium for vine growth. Weed control is typically by herbicides, disease control with systemic fungicides, pesticides used for insect pests, artificial fertilizer. That's the kind of view of conventional. Then we have sustainable. Now, there are various sustainability schemes in operation around the wine world. And one of the good things about these sustainability schemes is they do actually get wine growers to keep records, which is good. And there's usually a restricted set of chemical inputs, and this depends on how many, I mean, when you look around, it depends on how many of the sustainability schemes have been hijacked by the big companies. Because often what happens, the big companies have got seats at the table, they've got the money, and so they'll say, well, we like the idea of being sustainable, but what we're going to do is design a sustainability scheme around what we already do, and just rubber stamp what we already do. And I think that's not so good. But I do think that the best sustainability schemes encourage good practice. Herbicides usually still allowed in the sustainability schemes. And I mean, looking at New Zealand, for instance, there's a broad sustainable growing New Zealand scheme that 95% of producers there are enrolled in. And to take part in promotional activities with New Zealand wine growers, you have to be part of this scheme. And that's really good. It's a very broad definition of sustainability, so it kind of encourages everyone to join. But there has been a noticeable reduction in pesticide use in New Zealand. The figures are quite good. I haven't got them here, unfortunately. But that's kind of starting off in the right direction. It's getting people thinking about it, and it's getting everyone involved. But the problem with sustainability, I guess, is there's very little traction in the marketplace. So customers, consumers, people who buy wine, don't go to a wine aisle and say, which ones are certified sustainable? They might do that with organics. Organics has got traction in the marketplace. And I think this is, obviously there's a place where we have an internal discussion within the wine trade and the wine industry, but there's also a place where it's good to have some consumer recognition of farming and good farming versus bad farming. And I think the other problem with the word sustainable is that truly, there's Jeff Thorpe of Riverton Nurseries in New Zealand said this at a conference a few years ago, and I thought this was really good. He says sustainable is being able to do the same thing that we're doing now for 500 years. And if you can't carry on doing what you're doing now for 500 years, then it's not really sustainable. Organics and biodynamics, obviously we're all familiar with these. I won't spend much time on it. These arose in the 1930s and 40s, and actually looking at the history of it, biodynamics predated organics a little bit. So it was Ernest Pfeiffer who developed biodynamics from Steiner's lectures. He spent the 30s working out how these lectures, which were really just it wasn't Steiner's main focus. He just did a series of lectures on agriculture, and then his kind of people, he died fairly soon afterwards, his people then developed what we know now as the practice of biodynamics. And then in the 1940s, we have the emergence of organics, and organics was largely developed in the UK. It's really interesting history. But the emphasis of organics and biodynamics, which is good, is the emphasis on soil health. And in terms of agrochemicals, there's a little bit of a fudge here that you're allowed to use chemicals if they're traditional. So obviously for disease control, most of it relies on copper-based fungicides and elemental sulfur. And there's lots of interesting questions. We could talk about these a great deal, but I'm going to actually put the emphasis really on this topic of regenerative viticulture. And there are some challenges for organics, and a lot of it depends on the climate in which you're farming. If you're in a Mediterranean climate, then not so much. But if you're in a European climate where it's a bit damper, then we've got a problem. And the problem is that contact fungicides are washed off and need reapplying. Copper has toxicity issues. We know about those. Tillage, obviously organics and biodynamics rely a great deal in terms of weed control on manual tillage. And there's problems with tillage because it reduces the soil microlife. If you've got nice microbial things growing in your vineyard, really don't want to start turning the soil over. It's not a great idea. And then there's issues with carbon footprint, which can be higher if you're making more passes through your vineyard. So all of these things need to be borne in mind. And copper, some interesting studies on copper. There's one cited in Croatian vineyards there. They receive about 3 to 5 kilograms of copper fungicides each year. In Europe, obviously, it's regulated. And you've got a rolling, I think it's 6-year average where you have to stay under a certain level. But if you have a particularly bad year, you can use more as long as you use less the following year. And so they found copper levels significantly higher in vineyard soils than other soils, and 17 and 20 were contaminated with copper. Now, in the past, obviously, people were using a lot higher levels of copper. The insanely high levels in the past. It's regulated now. And French research group looked at copper levels in vineyard soils, and they range from 100 to 1,300 milligrams. So the kind of one of the conclusions they made is around 8 million hectares globally are affected by copper pollution. And a researcher called Claire Chenin, she said it does lead to a decrease in the diversity and abundance of soil microorganisms and a decrease in diversity of abundance of soil fauna. So obviously, if you're reliant on copper for downy mildew control, and let's face it, there are other alternatives, but they don't really work. All the studies that have looked at them have shown limited efficacy of alternatives to copper. So if that's your reliance on that, then there are issues in terms of the soil microlife, and that's something that has to be borne in mind. You see, the thing is, with viticulture is it's always going to be a compromise. But you have to choose your compromises, and the good viticulturalists make the good choices about the sorts of compromises they're going to make. There's no perfect way of farming vineyards. So the newcomer, regenerative farming, there's a little quote there from Eben. These pictures when I visited him back in November 19, and that's when he said, farming the vine is one aspect, but the money is between the rows. You must farm your soil, your cover crops. So what is regenerative viticulture, well, I think one of the ways to think about it is simply, it's the application agroecology. And this is a book by Miguel Altieri, very influential in agroecology. I was first turned on to him by Ted Lemon in 2010. He's a wine grower in California. He came to, he heard me give a talk at a conference, and he was saying, you really need to read this book by Altieri. And this agroecology is basically, when it's applied to vines, it's seeing the vineyard as an agro-ecosystem. So there's no template. You can't just say, this is what regenerative viticulture is like, this is what you need to go and do. You have to start seeing the vineyard as an agro-ecosystem, and then obviously a lot depends on your local climate, where you are in the wine world. That will affect how you do your viticulture. And it's combining insights from permaculture, regenerative approaches, and obviously regenerative is quite big in agriculture outside viticulture. It's already quite well established. You can go and read all about it. It's fairly new that people have started referring to regenerative viticulture. And so it's farming the soils, not the vines. And I guess the best way to think about regenerative approaches is to think about a toolkit. So you have a toolkit of regenerative practices that you can apply to the vineyard, and you pick the tools that are appropriate for the job at hand. So that will depend on where you are, what your local climate's like, what your goals are, and also where you're starting from is an important point. Because obviously there are certain ways you might plan a vineyard if you're starting from scratch, but often you're not starting from scratch. You're looking at a site that you already own, and therefore you start thinking, well, how can I bring in regenerative approaches to that site? So the toolkits, these are some things that I put down that we'll maybe discuss a little bit later. And the first thing, your goal is to establish a robust agro-ecosystem. And one of the keys to this is biodiversity. And in the regenerative world, they talk about ecosystem services. And what that means is you're getting your ecosystem to do the job that in conventional viticulture is done by inputs. So the key is to get, for instance, cover crops working, and they can, when cover crops are done well and the appropriate cover crops are chosen for your site and your place, and considering what state your vineyard is in, they're doing the job of a lot of inputs that would previously be added to the vine. So understanding biology is really interesting. So we saw yesterday a really interesting model of vineyards and climate and suitability. Now there's a very real possibility that if you've got good weather data, you feed those into those climate models, that you can actually predict when you're going to have certain problems with a good degree of accuracy. And there's a big cooperative in Alto Adige in Italy called Cavit, and they've got this model that's fantastic. So they've got hundreds of growers who work for them. Each of them have an app where they've modeled the terrain really beautifully, and they feed climate data into that terrain. And you can dial in your vineyard location, and they will say, well, this is what you need to be doing now, because this is the threat that you've got. Maybe you've got a downy mildew is going to be a risk. So you should be really applying your protection now. And this feeds into the concept of integrated pest management as well, which is a very well-established branch of agriculture, where you're looking at understanding the biology of your site in order to target interventions only when they're needed. Monitoring water status. Water is obviously a big factor now in vineyards worldwide, more so in Mediterranean climates particularly. With climate chaos, we've got a lot of issues with water. So in terms of understanding your vineyard, then the actual monitoring of not just the soil monitoring is one thing, it's actually monitoring what's going on in the vine, using pressure bombs and everything, and having real data about what's really happening, then that really helps to guide practice. One other factor in the toolkit is adapting the trellising canopy management to site and season. That's another thing that can be done. Better technology is another way of reducing inputs. If you've got a better spraying kit that's set up properly, then you're going to reduce inputs into the vineyard. It's kind of practical. And then also the tools to be able to do undervine management without necessarily using herbicides or massive tillage. Introducing animals into the vineyard is another thing that's been talked about a lot in regenerative circles. It has some challenges. The obvious one is sheep over winter, but there's lots of people looking at other animal inputs you can put into the vineyard that basically reduce the need for using other solutions. Agroforestry is being talked about as well, growing trees in vineyards. And there's, this is a difficult thing to do, but a lot of people in Europe are looking at this quite seriously now. And the other topic, the other part of the toolkit, and I put a question mark here because we discussed this yesterday, is whether we can actually adopt new vine material that will reduce the need for inputs into the vineyard. So the life of the soil. James Milton, who's a friend and a grower in New Zealand, he was the pioneer for biodynamics in New Zealand, is famous for a quote. He says, "We're not standing on dirt, but on the rooftop of another kingdom." And so 700 million years ago, plants emerged from the sea into land. And already when plants emerged, there was an association between the plants that emerged onto land and fungi. So the idea of mycorrhizal associations is ancient, and it goes back to the emergence of plants on land. And 80% of terrestrial plants have these mutually beneficial symbiotic relationships with fungi. And they're important. They become associated intimately with the roots, and they increase the uptake, and they increase the root surface area a great deal. And one way of looking at plant roots is as rhizosphere ambassadors. So the rhizosphere is the area around the roots themselves. And there's lots of communication taking place between the plant and other soil microorganisms and animals. There's a whole network of life that exists under the soil that we're beginning to understand a little bit more. And one of the tools for helping to understand this is next generation sequencing. In the past, if you wanted to understand microbes, you had to culture them, which is a bit like looking under the streetlights for your keys. It's like, it's all you could do is just culture things. And so you're just looking at a portion of what's actually there. Now with next generation sequencing, you can sequence very cheaply. Obviously, processing the data is a little bit more tricky. But you can get a sequencer that's about this big, that'll stick into your laptop, and bang, you've got all this information about what's actually there. And this is really expanding our understanding of what's taking place below the ground. And people don't realize, but plants, spend all this time creating all these, photosynthates, the stuff that they feed themselves with. They secrete a lot of different compounds into the soil. And the estimates are that between 10 and 40% of the plant's photosynthetically fixed carbon ends up in the soil. It's a deliberate policy by the plant. They're feeding the soil microorganisms because they're getting stuff back from stuff growing in the soil. So this is kind of cool. And there's a really interesting book called The Secret Life of Trees, which is by a University of British Columbia researcher called Suzanne Simard. And she was basically, in BC, they had all these forests, in remote places, and logging companies go in and clear them. And she was involved in doing working for the logging companies, doing research on how they can get these trees to grow back again quicker so they can go and log them again. And she found the real importance of these networks of mycorrhizal associations. And what was happening is that trees were communicating and sending energy, feeding other trees through these networks, and using carbon tracing, 13 carbon, she was able to show that photosynthase from one tree ended up in another tree. That's through these networks of interactions through the soils. And a tantalizing thought is that this might be happening in old vineyards as well. And there's been one study that suggests this might be occurring in an experimental setting, but it would be fascinating to do this sort of study in old vineyards as well, to look at how these vines are actually communicating and maybe sharing resources. And I know there's lots of glamorization of the science, and it sounds great, and people talk about intelligent forests and the intelligence of trees, which is obviously nonsense. But trees are really cool. I love trees, right? Trees are fantastic, but they're not smart, by our definition. Maybe they are, maybe they're spiritual, but I love trees. I think they're fantastic. I'm not knocking trees, but I'm knocking some of the people who take really good scientific ideas and then try and sell popular books on the back of them that kind of don't have much scientific basis. That's a diversion. So soil structure as well, we know this stuff. It's like organic material is really important. So soil organic material is really important for the structure and texture of soils. If aggregates are unstable, then the soil is easily compacted. Vine roots need about 10% air-filled spaces. Vines don't like growing with wet feet. 10 to 15% is kind of cool for a vine of air-filled spaces in the soil. And if you don't have these aggregate structures, then you can get crusting at the surface, which makes infiltration of water really difficult. So having this soil organic material is really, really important for infiltration, also soil structure. And this is one of the challenges, I think, with thinking about no-till. We'll come to this in a little bit, and also aware of the time. And also, I should say, this presentation, if anyone wants this presentation, just drop me a line on social media or something, you know, and I'll send it to you, because I realize I'm going through this stuff quite quickly. Yeah, you're welcome to it. So soil microlife is really important for soil structure. But then we've got this challenge, because if you're farming in arid conditions, then you know, the challenge is if you don't have stuff growing in the soil, you don't have life in the soil, you don't have soil organic material. And arid conditions, you get very low soil organic material. You want to increase that by having things growing in the soil, but then also you're worried about competition for water, and this can be a real thing. We'll come to this again later. This can be a real thing, but the thing is, having stuff growing in your soil also increases the ability of the soil to receive the rainfall when it does come, so the infiltration is better, and also soil organic material is really good at holding on to water in the soil. So it's like this kind of balance. It's like it's using the toolkit intelligently, depending on where you are, that gives you this really effective regenerative approach to farming. And this is just a quick picture just showing the, this was at Waterkloof, taken a few years ago, and this was literally 10 yards apart. You've got a vineyard that's been treated with herbicides, and then you've got a vineyard where it's been biodynamic since planting, and you can put your hand in the soil in the one that's been farmed biodynamically, whereas the one that's just across the road would have been treated with herbicides, so you kind of need a hammer and a nail to get into that soil. Saying goodbye to herbicides, I think this is something that the wine world is going to have to face up to at some stage. But I would say that there's a lot of anti-scientific understanding of herbicides. So people are against glyphosate because they've heard of glyphosate, they've heard of Roundup. But actually, of the herbicides that have been used in viticulture in the past, glyphosate's pretty cool. It's actually the least damaging herbicide. So if you, because of popular opinion, if you sort of eliminate glyphosate or Roundup, and then other herbicides come back, these other guys are much, much worse. So we have to be really careful about this, that we don't just have this sort of like ill-informed view of science that then leads policy. You can't have your president saying, we're banning glyphosate, and so, okay, that's fine. Then the other herbicides will come back, and they're worse, so we want to avoid that. Vineyard establishment, obviously, when you're establishing a vineyard, it's really, really hard to do it with competition from weeds. So herbicides sometimes are used in organic vineyards and establishment. That's what people will recommend. And then you go organic afterwards. And then alternatives are kind of slightly artificial but effective ones, like using Extende, which is a fabric material which lasts about 7 or 8 years. And it's problematic to get rid of. But again, this illustrates the compromise that sometimes has to be made in viticulture. A big emphasis in regenerative farming is tilling versus no-till. So weed control is a major issue in viticulture. So the reason that tillage is kind of frowned upon in regenerative terms is just because of the effect on the soil microlife. It's really, really problematic for the soil microbes when you start turning the soil over. It looks really good. It looks really healthy. But exposing soil like that, turning it over, is not something you really want to be doing if you don't have to. Some examples. This was from Swartland a couple of years ago. Rosa showed some pictures of Roundstone yesterday, and this is one of the vineyards I think is a really good example of intelligent approaches to viticulture being put into place. So that's Roundstone. That's some of the new bush founds. They use active cover cropping. They have refuge areas of feinbosch. And that's another picture that we showed yesterday. You see those blocks that Rosa talked about, and then you've got those refuge areas of feinbosch, and you've got the contour planting. So all this is a really intelligent way of approaching a vineyard. They're not organic, but they're pretty much organic. But sometimes, you know, the best choice might be to use, in certain circumstances, systemic fungicides. And this is really one of the things I think is really important, is when it comes to regenerative, is we don't necessarily have to tie it to organics as organics is currently practiced. Organics may not be the most sustainable solution for running vineyards, depending on your climate. Some more pictures of the Feinbosch refuge areas, and also a trellised block, an older block that's trellised that's been converted to bush vines, because in this environment, bush vines tend to be perhaps the most sustainable way of growing these particular varieties. Not so good for Syrah, because Syrah has it's fragile and the stems can break off if they're not supported. So often, even like in the southern Rhone, for instance, you might see a lot of vineyards where there's some trellising just for the Syrah, and the Grenache and all the other varieties are bush vines. So it's about the intelligent approach to viticulture rather than following rules. I've got some quotes here from Chris on cover crops and mulching, which I think in the interest of time I won't be able to read out, but if anyone wants to read this. But basically, they've got two different sites where they work, the Kastilberg and the Paderberg, and the Paderberg has a different approach of cover crops than the Kastilberg because there are different needs in those soils. Eben has been very thoughtful about viticulture, and some of the vineyards that he's now got, he actually owns vineyards now, and the way he's approached it I think is really, really interesting. So a lot of, again, use of cover crops. He says in the early stages of summer we use a quad bite to roll the weeds to avoid compaction. It creates a crisscross carpet. So this is the idea of the cover crops, and we saw some of these in the vineyards yesterday. You grow a cover crop, and then rather than mow it or plough it in, you can flatten it or crimp it. And if you do that, that creates a nice mulch, which keeps soil temperatures down in a fairly warm Mediterranean-style climate like the Western Cape. It keeps soil temperatures down, it inhibits weed growth, and then when you want to sow a cover crop, you can actually then direct drill it without tillage into this mat that exists. Again, organic products that he's using there, so seaweed fertilizer and various trichoderma preparations. This is in New Zealand. This is in a vineyard in Nelson, famous vineyard, Nooidorf, and this is just looking at cover cropping here. And for instance, you know, this daikon radish is a really good taproot, and that improves the soil structure really nicely. So thinking about ways of using cover crops to do a job that in past you might have had to do with various inputs. This is another example of Phycelia. This is in Martinbury, New Zealand. It works as green manure, traps bees and beneficials. So again, this is an intelligent approach of using cover crops targeted appropriately to place to do the sorts of jobs that you want to do. This is Mimi Castile. She's from Oregon. She's a wine grower, and she's one of the leading voices in regenerative farming. She always talks a lot of sense. So she says soils have two ways to hold water. One is with clay. So if you have some clay in your soil, you're a bit better off in terms of water holding capacity. But if you don't have clay, the only way to hold water is with soil organic matter. And she says a 1% increase in soil organic matter can allow the soil to hold around 68,000 extra litres of water per acre. Obviously it's in America, so acres. So you have to, I think it's 2.2 you multiply it by for hectares, but I'm not sure. I should know that. So, you know, this really is a very interesting way of building resilience into vineyards, is taking this approach of regenerative farming. And obviously in an era of climate chaos, what we're really looking for is more resilient vineyards, vineyards that can cope with not just a warming trend, but just variation from year to year that's quite extreme. And Mimi talks here about the importance of bare soil. She says plants are there to put carbon into the soil to feed microorganisms that then unlock micronutrients and make them available. Roots touching rocks don't make mineral wines. It's a microbial pathway that makes that possible. So tilling the soil is setting that system back to an initial stage of evolution, and those very delicate interactions between microorganisms are interrupted regularly. This is to show that actually in France, you know, it's been really surprising to see the uptake of regenerative farming, even in places where you might not expect it, like Champagne. So I was there in September 21 with Mum. So it's Martel, Mum, Perrier, Jouet, a big company. They have about 200 hectares of their own vines. They've been trialling regenerative farming. And in Champagne, you think of Champagne as not being the most environmentally sensitive vineyard region. And obviously, it's a very challenging climate to do organics in because it's quite damp there. But actually, they've been trialling it in 3 hectares, and they rolled it up last year to 6 hectares of trials. They've also been looking at agroforestry. And so this really is being taken quite seriously. Especially, I mean, I'd say across France, I'm seeing a lot of interest in regenerative approaches and people actually putting it into practice. I mentioned arid regions because this is somewhere where we have to sort of again, let's say there's no template that you can roll out. You can't say, this is the manual for how to farm regeneratively. And I was speaking to Steve Mathiasen last week, who was in London. Steve is a wine grower in Napa. He also makes his own wines, but he farms lots of vineyards in Napa for clients. Really smart guy. He's organic, but he's also looking at regenerative approaches. The picture below isn't from Napa, that's from Central Otago. That shows some of the schist soils. You know, this is an arid wine region, and where you have arid wine regions, not much grows in the soil, so you don't get lots of soil organic material. But Steve's been looking at doing no-till, and it hasn't really worked in his vineyards for a number of reasons. First of all, he found that growing a cover crop can be quite challenging there. He's tried crimping, but the way it works in his vineyards is when he tries to crimp, they don't crimp properly, and as a result, because it's quite dry. And if you don't crimp the cover crop properly, it will just grow back again. So you've got to be able to effectively kill it as you lay it down in a mulch. And it's just, he's saying with the vineyards he's working in, this doesn't work so well. But, and the other issue is found that really in the summer, you have quite an extreme Mediterranean climate there. He was finding there was too much competition in some of his sites when you had stuff growing there during the growing season. So his solution is to do a light tillage. So he's turning the soil, but not too much. And the other problem they have there is in the actual vine rows themselves in California, you've got problems with gophers and voles. And if you leave stuff in the actual vine row, then you get massive problems with these gophers and voles, and they ring lots of your vines. They love living under the cover, and it makes that really impractical. So this is people trying to do the right thing, but they're not following a recipe book. And he's saying with the approach of growing a cover crop in winter and then tilling it lightly, he finds he's still getting an increase in soil organic material. And some people might keep permanent cover, but if you've just got grass there and you're not using cover crops, what you can find is there's nutrient cycling within that small layer there, but you're not getting actually soil organic material ending up further down. Disease, this is obviously a big issue, and this is one of the challenges of viticulture. And the big ones, obviously, downy mildew and powdery mildew, and then botrytis is a problem as well. And this is where breeding new varieties is quite interesting, because the science is clear. Vitis vinifera does not have R genes for downy and powdery mildew. You do not have resistance without R genes. This is how plants work. Plant resistance, we haven't got time to talk about it properly, but you can talk about increasing the immunity of your vines, and there are things you can do to make your vines a little bit more resistant. But without the R genes, you're never going to have a solution to downy and powdery mildew. So we're reliant on spray. Some places, obviously, downy is more of a problem than others if it's a bit damper. Powdery isn't about damp. Powdery is a problem that's not to do with damp regions. You get it everywhere. And so these problems have really caused big issues for viticulture, and they're not going to go away. And so this is why a lot of people are thinking about breeding new varieties, as we heard yesterday. So the only really way to reduce spraying is to have new vine varieties with pyramided resistance genes. So you need 2 resistance genes against downy, 2 resistance genes against powdery, because then you've got a durable resistance. Obviously, if you have just one, then there's a good chance that the fungi or the oomycetes will be able to develop some resistance. And in New Zealand, for instance, powdery is a real problem because they've got the Cleistothecea, which is the sexual stage as well. So obviously the ability of fungi to develop resistance, to overcome the resistance from just one R gene is quite high. So pyramided resistance genes is non-negotiable when you're looking at pewees and residual varieties. And really things are taking off in Europe, especially with these varieties. I'll show you some pictures. The Nouveauté, which is Foncoliau, which is Artaban and Vidocq, and Ducourt in Bordeaux. And obviously we've got Voltis, the new variety that's been approved in Champagne. So people are taking these seriously because these varieties do actually provide, basically, you probably have to do 1 spray a year for most of them, because there's a good reason to do 1 spray a year, because you're stopping any extra, it's an extra insurance against resistance developing. But this is something that is, we should be discussing. Is this something that is part of the new viticulture? regenerative farming. And you know, we had a bit of a discussion about it yesterday. I realize it's a little bit controversial. The really controversial thing is genetic modification. But I come from a scientific background, so I understand that, that genetic modification is completely safe. It's not a problem. You know, if you're insulin dependent, you're injecting yourself with insulin that's produced by genetic modification. Genetic modification is not something to be scared of. The only reason to be scared about genetic modification for viticulture would be the bottleneck effect that we would have. What would happen is, because of the cost and the challenges of producing new varieties with these resistance genes, and I should add that this is the only way we can keep our favorite varieties. The only way we can keep Chenin Blanc for the future, really, if we want to be truly sustainable in viticulture, is by introducing some resistance genes into Chenin Blanc. Then you can keep Chenin, that's fantastic. But the problem is this bottleneck. So we have, you know, we talked yesterday of the many thousands of varieties. There's probably 2,000 or 3,000 varieties commercially farmed at the moment across the world, Vitis vinifera. And, you know, we like this diversity. We love this diversity. I shouldn't talk about diversity of wine grapes in the Chenin conference, because this is, but we do actually enjoy the diversity of wine grapes, and it's something that we want to treasure, and it's something we want to keep. The problem with the genetic modification is we'll end up with a situation where we'll end up with even fewer varieties grown commercially, because the commercial advantage of growing resistant Chenin Blanc would mean that, you know, any other clones of Chenin Blanc would go. You just end up with one clone of Chenin Blanc, and everyone would grow it. You'd just end up with Chenin, Pinot Noir, Syrah, Riesling, Chardonnay, you know, the famous varieties. And we'd lose everything else, because the commercial advantage of using a fully resistant variety would make it a no-brainer. But obviously, it's not technically that easy to do. It is possible with grape varieties. I chatted to the guys in Australia at Syro, who developed the technology for vinifera, first of all, quite recently. And you know, weirdly, it's much easier with table grapes than it is with wine grapes. But basically, at the moment, nobody is going to start farming with GM vines, because nobody's going to buy the wines. But you know, this frustrating thing scientifically is it works, and it would be a way of us keeping the varieties that we have and farming in a more sustainable way. So that's just something. I'm not advocating it. I'm just saying that this is an interesting discussion that the wine world should have, because you know, a lot of the food you'll be eating, especially if you're in the USA and Canada, will be GM. You know, the genie is already out of the bottle. You know, it's there. So on that note, some conclusions. I think we need a new scientifically rational viticulture. You know, there are certain challenges, especially in the face of climate chaos. We want to have resilient vineyards, and good science, which I think regenerative farming is one way towards that. Using a toolkit with insights from organic and biodynamic and regenerative approaches, emphasizing our new understanding of the importance of soil life as it applies to vineyards. And we need a viticulture that's modified to take account of specific site characteristics. So not one template, not one recipe, an intelligent application depending on where you are and the particular challenges of your site and where you're starting from. And I said before, and I say it again, there's no perfect solution when it comes to viticulture. We have to choose our compromises. And finally, I would say that now there is a moral imperative on everyone involved in growing wine grapes to be sustainable. It's not optional anymore. I think there's a moral imperative on us to do that. And so with that, I will finish. Thank you very much for your attention.
Jamie, stay with us because we're going to talk a little bit more about this. Ken Forrester, Mr. Ken Forrester, Président, Association Chenin Blanc.
President of the Chenin Blanc Association. Et
Daniel Skittekat van IPW, please. Corlia Fourie, the winemaker of Bosman Adama. Dani de Waal, viticulturist of de Morgenson. Evelyne de Pontbriand, president l'Académie du Chenin Blanc, mais aussi la propriétaire du domaine du
owner of the
the conversation on this this topic. And Monsieur Ken Forrester, you will lead the discussion, and if we have a little bit of time, I hope, maybe we can take a few questions. I let you lead.
Thank you, Noretta. Good morning, everybody, and thank you. Welcome to the panel. After what Jamie had to say, and I think really, really interesting, it opens up all sorts of concepts. Can you imagine genetically modified vineyards, for example? But, you know, I think it's a discussion, as Jamie said, that we need to have. And I think it's very controversial. And I think that when we're talking about organics, we're talking about regenerative viticulture, excuse me, we're talking largely about the market effect. First of all, we have a responsibility as farmers to the planet. That goes without saying. That responsibility we cannot avoid. But beyond that, talking about viticulture, talking about organics, is it just pure marketing? Is this what the public needs to know, excuse me, before they'll buy our wine? What do we do? How do we communicate what we're doing? Is there a way? Is regenerative? Is biological? What do we need to say? And how do we need to control this? In terms of what Jamie was saying, he's saying that there are options and there are choices and there are compromises. Now, one has to be very careful with the compromises, because you could end up being slightly pregnant, and that's a problem. That's a problem. I mean, how do we possibly justify this? I mean, so there's a huge discussion to be had, and I'd like this to turn into a little argument, possibly. I think we could argue about this quite happily, and I think it would bring out the best if we did get some little controversial notions going. So we start off in South Africa with one of the most advanced systems in the world, the IPW system, which is the integrated production of wine, which is a very strenuous record-keeping system and a points-based scoring system as to farming responsibly. What it does is it measures all of your chemical inputs, it measures all of your outputs, it measures your waste, it measures your water treatment, and there's a list. I mean, we all know, or many of us know about that. In my mind, that's a minimum standard. IPW should be what everybody aspires to. I think it should be a minimum standard for South African viticulture. The people who aren't involved in IPW, seriously, I feel you're missing out. So I think that that's a critical aspect of what we're doing. Perhaps we could just get from Daniel Skiddercut a mention on the IPW system that he sits in control of so far.
Thank you, Ken. Ken, I think the doctor also summed it up very good earlier. It's a system through sustainability that we would like to encourage the South African wine farmers that what they are doing now, they can still be doing in the next few hundred years. I think that's the most important, that's the critical thing. So I think we've established ourselves in such a way in the wine industry that we, through science and sound viticultural and winemaking practices, we are trying to achieve that. And I think this regenerative discussion is a new chapter, also not for South Africa, but also for the IPW system, where we can be involved in the next level, call it IPW Next Level or IPW Restarted, IPW 2.0. So we are excited to be part of that discussion today, and also to see the South African wine farmers taking part in discussions like that.
Evelyn, perhaps you can give us a point of view from where you sit in the French bubble, so to speak. How do you feel about organics? How do you feel about the different standards? There's no one standard for organics.
No, there are some.
Yes. Just
Do you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Well, I think in Anjou, we are quite a large group of organic viticultures. Some of us also biodynamic, but that's another question. We became very conscious of soil life and balance in the landscape, in the biodiversity. And so there is a big trend of moving forward in that direction.
And specifically, what are the challenges in terms of chemical usage? Are you still using copper?
Yes, we are still using copper. I'm not sure I agree with the figures that Jamie put in the pollution of the soils. I think our soils have been analyzed. If you have a good dispersion, the copper doesn't go on the soil. But you should use very little, and that's what we do. So there is a way to avoid polluting the soil. But of course, copper is not ideal, and there is some research now with biocontrol. We have an experimentation going on in my domain. So it's using neutral molecules that avoid the multiplication of the fungus. So it could be a solution. It's an interesting solution. But research in planting hedges and working with the balance in the landscape is also an interesting solution.
Sorry, I'd certainly welcome any comments from the audience. If anybody would like to ask any questions, there's there's room for this debate to turn into a proper scrap. I mean, let's have a go at it. Jamie, what do you think? Give us?
Look, I think the important thing is not necessarily to have a scrap. I think one of the problems with viticulture is that you have ended up, that has ended up sort of like a sort of like that science has got a bad rap, and there's been, I've had spent a lot of time in biodynamic farms, talked to biodynamic practitioners. One of the problems there is language. A lot of what's being done by biodynamic practitioners is scientifically you can explain why it's going to work. It's not going to work by magical, mystical forces and everything. This is one of the problems, is that effectively, for instance, when I fly a plane, I'm very happy for the pilot to be flying the plane, but I don't want the pilot to be servicing the engines, So I think often what happens is the people who are growing wines using, for instance, biodynamics, and often making fantastic wines, and the vineyards look fantastic, it's really exciting. But I don't want to necessarily take their explanations of why it's working. And this is where you have the problem with the scientists and the practitioners, because sometimes the explanations that are given are in a language which scientists, basically, there's no common ground. And so I think what we really need is to understand that good science isn't against biodynamics. It's about good farming, and the science. In terms of viticulture, the scientific papers that have been published really haven't looked at most of these really interesting questions. And this is why I think when it comes to viticulture, good science isn't just about looking at the scientific literature, because a lot of the research there is limited, and it's done on certain vineyards that maybe aren't representative of some of the vineyards that make very interesting wine. The experience of practitioners is so valuable, and I think good science takes the science, but also goes and looks and sees what people are doing, listens to them, looks at the vineyards, and it's that kind of that amalgamation, the gathering together of the real experience across many different types of vineyards, coupled with an understanding of the scientific principles that leads us into the right place. So when it comes to copper, I think that this is an interesting discussion. I think, that it is problematic. How problematic? Well, modern formulations of copper mean that you have to use less. But then when you go through, the vineyard, I remember going to Germany in 2016 in August, and all the organic vineyards were absolutely hammered by downy mildew. That basically, there just wasn't enough copper allowed to be used to protect those vineyards. And 2016 was an absolute disaster in the organic vineyards. So there are issues, That's a very long meandering, sort of sitting on the fence answer, but I think we need to think about replacing copper. It's problematic.
Collier, you have a vast experience, different sites, different properties, a cultivar garden, as well as a nursery operation. Can you give us your ideas on?
Well, sitting here in front of an audience like this, I'm always quite cautious talking about our journey, just because it is so personal. I think the big thing about regenerative agriculture and viticulture is that it is so unique to your own set of what your situation is. So for Bosman, yes, we are invested in the full value chain. We have the vine nursery, we do plant improvement, we have vineyards, cellars, different regions. And all of these things mean that it is such a complex grid and an understanding of where we are and knowing that we're so far off. Even just getting that base point, knowing where we're starting, I think is the most important thing. So if I can say anything about our journey, the important thing is that just trying to get to the point where you know where you are and what those goals are for you in the future is maybe the most important thing. I do think that for us specifically, what we've been doing in the nursery has been the most effective. Going from doing irrigation on big scale to drip irrigation, got us some 20% more water that we could use so that our fallow fields could be under cover crop more of the year, using ancient grains like teff. So the advances there has been big, but it's because in the nursery, it is such a high intensity planting regime and schedule. If you look at our vineyards, I think, Evelyn, you talking about gardens this morning really just reiterated for me that in regenerative, it does feel that you're tending to a garden. You're tending to a microsphere in which so many more things are possible. So I'm an avid gardener at home. I mean, bought a house, the soil was absolutely dead to the extent that, it was hydrophobic, couldn't plant anything. And it was absolutely amazing knowing that by working with, just composting and actually using the compost tea that we make on the farm, it was so visual and so dramatic. So I think that the wonderful thing is that it is attainable. It is definitely a journey, but I do urge you to start with that baseline and see where you want to go.
Thank you. Thanks so much. And obviously, you're measuring. You've got to measure. That baseline is a measurement at some point.
I think the scary thing is the moment that you go into this journey, you actually know you're not measuring the right things. Just getting the measurements right, is a whole system all on its own. So I think, Daniel, the most important thing, or the most, the big idea and the big data in the end is how do we take something which is so unique to every setup and almost have a baseline or a way of knowing where we are. With organics, I mean, we've converted some 15% of our production to organics now, but I mean, it's a standard. You tick some boxes every year. Fair trade, for instance, I mean, because regenerative, we haven't spoken about it, but also talks about people to some extent. There it's a progressive standard, but it's also ticking boxes, whereas regenerative for me is actually, this moving goal. As soon as you know where you are, the goals shift again. So getting a grid, because the IPW, what I've found, I think it's the most amazing scheme in the world. I do. But this regenerative part is going to be interesting. And how do we quantify it? How do we set goals? Because it is so specific to each producer.
Yeah, absolutely good. Donald, would you like to?
Yeah, I think that's a very good point you make because of the buy-in from the South African wine industry. We've got such a vast majority of people taking part in the scheme. If we can have those measurements, those exact things that we have to measure and we have to adhere to, we can actually roll it out as a South African industry initiative. And I think there's great opportunity in that. And I think the good thing is there's not one specific recipe that works for everybody. I think that's the beauty in it. You can actually adapt in your own environment, in your own growing area to what is the most suitable practices for your system and your area. And I think there's great opportunity for IPW to play a role there.
So the Duval family's been farming Stellenbosch Kloof for how long? Over 100 years?
Yeah, few generations, yes, few generations.
Yeah. So your views on that, please, would you?
Yeah, I'm practically in the vineyard every day, so from my side, it's more of a starting point. Where can we find that starting point to show guys, this is how small you can start, this is what you have available for yourself, and then pulling that into practice and making it easy for everyone to join it. That's really important. And IPW can provide us with some of those guidelines, then that'll make it much more accessible.
I think with the help of industry.
So the key words are regenerative, sustainability. We're hearing that that there are compromises, that there's a baseline, that there's a measurement. What are we measuring? And that famous American general who said that there are known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And I think that that's very real. I think there are a lot of questions that we know how to ask, and I think there are a lot of questions that we don't even know how to ask, how to measure. What are we measuring? What do we need to be measuring? And what really, if we're talking about the microbial function in the soil, how far do we measure? How deep do we go? And what are we looking at? What is the elemental drive? What are the elemental drivers that we need to be looking at? So we have regenerative viticulture. We have at this stage a certification system for sustainability and ethically produced vines. That's where we sit. The problem with that system is that at this stage, it doesn't provide a marketing tool because it stands on the back of the bottle. So we're putting a sticker on the back label. Once you put that bottle on the shelf, who knows? We're standing in a dark cupboard winking, and nobody knows what we're doing, but we do. It's time to actually take that to the market and to present to the market some form of communication in simple terms that says regenerative or says biological or says, and to do that, obviously there has to be a minimum standard, a basis. And hence, I think we have to kind of look at where we find that baseline. And within that standard, as Jamie suggested earlier, yes, there's room for compromise. There are, if you, in your site, need less water, more copper, less copper, there's room for compromise. Perhaps on one hand you'll score less, on the other hand you'll score more, but you need to come to some balance that provides the public with an assurance that we are in fact upholding our oath to the earth to look after the planet.
One thing would be interesting is to maybe think about a results-based certification rather than a process-based, because obviously you'll be using different elements of the toolkit depending on where you are. And so if we could find some metrics that really measure the effectiveness of the toolkit application, I think that would be great. Soil organic material could be one, you know, some way of measuring diversity or biodiversity in the vineyard could be another. But also what would be interesting would be integrating an idea of where you started from and where you are now, because obviously people will start from different places. And I think one of the key things is that I think one of the appeals to regenerative farming is the idea that anyone can play. You know, you could have thousands of hectares of vineyards, or you could have 2.5 hectares of vineyards, and it should be bringing people on board, even if they're big commercial entities. I think that's really important, because it's all very well having a form of farming that's going to change the world, but if it's only practiced on 1% of viticultural land globally, that's no use. It needs to be applied everywhere. And I think I think that's my view, is trying to bring everyone on board and have some sort of results-based certification rather than process.
And talking about everyone on board, that would require a kind of international cooperation. It's beyond just a national standard. And I think that's part of the problem, is currently organic certification in Canada, in Sweden, in America, is all different. There's no one standard. And I think we need to somehow get to the point where we can communicate this inclusivity and the sign-up that the farmers are farming sustainably. The buzzword that's been kind of going now for just probably 2 or 3 years, I think, Jamie, maybe longer, regenerative. People are talking regenerative and looking at regenerative. And regenerative really is, I think, the true kind of requirement that what you're doing with the soil should be able to regenerate itself going forward. You should be adding sufficient microbes, you should be adding sufficient activity to the soil, that the soil itself is regenerative, self-sustaining in a way. And when I look at what we've been doing in South Africa for the last, ever since I can remember, we've been planting cover crops. We've been cutting back on weed killers. We're not using glyphosate, for example. We haven't used glyphosate for the last 5 years on our property. And when we look at what are we doing to control weeds, we're tilling. What are we doing? We're rolling cover crops. We're providing a diversity of cover crops. And South Africa has been doing this. I just thought to myself, we're not behind on the curve. We're probably ahead of the curve in terms of regenerative farming. But we need to recognize it, and we need to somehow communicate that.
Yes, I think what...
Hello, everyone. My name is Jaco. I'm a viticulturist. Jamie, thank you very much for your talk. It's refreshing to hear someone talk about regenerative farming and not in a dogmatic way of punishing the conservative or the conventional farmers as well, because a big leg of these farming practices is economical as well. And economics, if the economic leg of this chair falls, then everything else falls as well. But there's 1,000 things that went through my mind, and I've got a million questions. But just a quick comment on the discussion that you're having right now is with communicating something to the market. Is from a farmer's perspective, there's 500,000 of these things going on and being forced onto farmers from the market. One market wants Vita, one market wants IPW, one market wants something else. I think a better way to drive something like this is almost like you're saying through the results. But then we should have had 20 regenerative farmers on that panel right now saying that we're farming regeneratively successfully, both in economics, both in, like Corlia said, which is important with regards to the people that's working for us as well. So I think if we can start leading like that, and Ken, I'm glad you made that comment as well. I was fortunate enough to spend some time in Australia and in France this year. And in both situations, I was asked by the viticulturists, like, what have you learned here? And I said, I'm glad I farm in South Africa. Because we are ahead. We have been doing cover crops and actually regenerative farming for the past 20 years without calling it that. Our farmers have been proactively trying to move away from herbicides. And I always see on the screen the word pesticide. I don't think I've used a pesticide. I think I've used a pesticide like 6 times in 15 years. It's not something farmers just spray willy-nilly. I think you guys can start removing pesticides from the board, because our biggest problem is herbicides, okay? And especially farming in an arid or a semi-arid area, vine competition from weeds is really, really a challenge. And I'm so glad, like I said, you spoke about the compromises, because Eben and myself always talk about the moral dilemma of which one is better with regards to spraying organically with regards to fungicides. If you spray conventionally in the Swartland, we might go through 4 times or 5 times with a tractor. And spraying organically, we have to go through 9 to 12 times. And you have to think about the impact on the environment of that, the impact on the tractors on the soil, the impact of using diesel from fossil fuels. So there's, like you say, there's a compromise to everything. I'm thinking about all the stuff I wanted to say. And also with Evelyn, with regards to the copper, I was with Dr. Dylan Krieg in Australia, and they started using these sprayers that recycle the spraying while they're spraying. So they're trying to reduce the amount of fungicides or coppers or sulfurs that actually fall onto the ground with machines that's sucking it back into the system. So there's great stuff that we can do, that you can keep on using copper and start looking to technology to help us apply it better. Okay, that's it, and I might think about more stuff later. Thank you.
Thank you. Were there any other questions from the floor, please?
No coffee break, huh?
Ken, this is a fascinating discussion, and you asked for an argument, so I'm going to give you an argument. Before I do, Jamie, I want to applaud you for your last slide before you concluded, and that's the topic of GMOs. While you claim not to be advocating GMOs, I am unequivocally advocating GM. And I just want to raise the issue of GM 2.0. We've heard 2.0, and that's called genome editing. And I'm not so sure the audience are totally aware that now, with a new generation of editing, we do not necessarily introduce new foreign genetic material into crops, which is one of the big issues. So that's the statement. My question is this to the panel. What are we going to do, considering there's no single template for everything, to bring the very narrow-minded organic side of things to the other side where genome editing possibly contribute to the sustainability issue. What are the panel's comments or thoughts about bringing these two groupings together to make viticulture sustainable over the longer term? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Evelyn, would you like to, so who would like to respond?
That's a very tough question.
Pardon.
Well, I think a place like the Congress here is a very good place to discuss and to exchange our point of view, and maybe that will help progress, understanding each other. I agree. But there is no answer nowadays to these very different point of views. I think maybe progresses in science. I've met some astrophysicians recently who thought that with infrared they could see mildew and oidium, for example. They could see that the conditions were there so that it would develop. And seeing the conditions before would help solve the problem before it happens. That's maybe one solution. I think science could, is certainly very important to find more solutions.
Johan, I think it's amazing that on situations and times like this, I mean, there I've learned something, editing instead of, manipulation. So it's about the information, it's about that sharing. One of the things what I think about regenerative, which has been amazing, is that it's not formalized. I think people have been, learning so much because they've been, led to their own devices, led to their own vineyards, having to figure out things that farmers in the hundreds of years ago might have known and have forgotten. So in our cellar, there's a beam. It says 1867, 42 lager. So that was the whole harvest report of the previous winemaker. One little encryption for a whole vintage. And what we do now, we sit in, behind a computer and we need to do all of this admin. On the other hand, I think that regenerative viticulture gives us the, the possibility and this wonderful, what a wonderful thing to know that there isn't this set thing. This is your farm. This is something that you need to sort out. And I think it's going to get to how do we get the forums and people talking to each other about this? How do we get the information about what is possible on, that level? I mean, the wonderful thing I think that we're also talking about here today is Chenin. And I think that we should do some research just on how resilient Chenin as a plant is. I think actually that if you needed to go and edit a grape, it should be Chenin because you're halfway there.
So we are in the middle of a debate that I also started yesterday, and with regards to genomes and genetics. And it's good that this debate is taking place because all of the opinions need to be expressed. We are in a scientific congress, and that's where we exchange. So with regard to what Jamie said, because he did raise the question of what he talked about the bottlenecks. And it's a question also that I raised yesterday. It's to say that today, or nowadays, we are actually fantasize a little bit